Los Angeles, people speak of Brennan Reeves like they speak of a monster lurking in the shadows. He doesn't smile. He doesn't love. He knows only one thing: protect his mother at any cost. But then, tragedy struck on one fateful night. His mother was ambushed by enemies, left bleeding in a dark alley with a fatal wound. And the one who saved her wasn't his army of men, wasn't a $1 million doctor. It was a chubby girl quietly handing out free medicine to the homeless. She dragged his mother into her cramped dwelling. She stitched the wound with surgical precision using her emergency kit, no anesthesia, yet her hands never trembled. And when the mafia boss kicked down her door, pointing a gun at her head, she looked him straight in the eyes and said, "Shoot me, but then who will save your mother?" That was the first time in his life Brennan Reeves lowered his gun for a woman. If you want to know how this monster fell in love with her, hit like right now. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next, because this story has only just begun. Brennan lowered the gun. His hand was still wrapped tightly around the cold, unforgiving metal grip, but the barrel was pointed at the floor now. The room was so small that the 4 bodyguards standing at the door had already taken up almost all the space. Poor. Walls stained with damp patches. Parts of the ceiling were peeling, but it was strangely clean. Not a speck of dust on the bookshelf. Not a stain on the old wooden floor. And what caught Brennan's attention most was the glass cabinet in the corner of the room. An herbal medicine cabinet, packed with carefully labeled glass bottles, larger than the modest wardrobe beside it. Who was she to keep such a vast apothecary in this dilapidated flat? Marlo didn't look at him. She kept her back to Brennan as if the mafia boss who had just kicked open her door were nothing more than an ordinary visitor. She continued her work, checking Helena's pulse, adjusting the bandage on her shoulder, watching her breathing. Every movement was precise, decisive, without a single second of hesitation. Her hands were large and rough, not the hands of any woman Brennan had ever known, but every motion was exact, like a machine programmed with perfect certainty. Keith, Brennan's most trusted bodyguard, started to step forward. His hand had already moved to the gun at his side, his eyes fixed on Marlo with suspicion. Brennan raised one hand to stop him. Keith froze, but he didn't take his eyes off the strange woman. Helena was breathing steadily. Her chest rose and fell gently beneath the thin blanket Marlo had pulled over her. Alive, stable. That was all Brennan needed to know for now. He looked at the woman in front of him. She wasn't beautiful by any standard he had ever known. She didn't have the narrow waist of the girls in the nightclubs he owned. She didn't have the smooth, fair skin of the models who had tried to get close to him. No makeup, no expensive perfume, not a single piece of jewelry on her. Only a wrinkled hospital uniform and a pair of strangely calm brown eyes. Eyes without fear, without pleading, without curiosity. Only complete focus on the work in front of her. "Who are you?" Brennan asked, his voice still cold as steel. It was the voice that made all of Los Angeles tremble. The voice that made enemies shake and beg for mercy. The voice that had never failed to bend anyone to his will. Marlo didn't lift her head. She was checking Helena's pupils with a small flashlight. "The person saving your mother's life. Unless you want her to bleed out on my floor, the questions can wait." Brennan fell silent. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever told him to wait. No one had ever dared turn their back on him while he was asking a question. He could have ordered Keith to seize her that very second. He could have forced an answer out of her in any way he wanted. But he didn't, because his mother was lying there, and she was the only one taking care of her. A few minutes passed in silence. There was only Helena's steady breathing and the soft sound of Marlo moving around the bed. At last, Marlo stood up. She wiped her hands on a white towel, now stained a pale pink. "I only treated the wound temporarily. She needs to be taken somewhere safe, somewhere with proper medical equipment. I don't have a CT scanner in this apartment." For the first time, she looked straight into Brennan's eyes. No avoidance, no lowered head. She simply looked at him directly, as if he were just an ordinary man. "Why did you save her?" Brennan asked. This was the question he truly wanted answered. No one ever did anything without a purpose. No one gave without wanting something in return. That was the law of the world he lived in. "You didn't know who she was." Marlo looked at him, her gaze not wavering in the slightest. "I didn't need to know who she was. I only needed to know that she needed saving." Brennan stood there. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. The answer was too simple, too true, too different from everything he had ever heard. In his world, people saved each other for money, for power, for profit. No one saved a stranger just because that stranger needed saving. He looked at her one more time. The heavy-set woman in the wrinkled uniform, the woman who had just saved his mother's life with ordinary needle and thread in a miserable apartment. The woman who dared look straight into the eyes of the most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles, without trembling at all. "Take my mother to the car," Brennan ordered his bodyguards, his eyes still fixed on Marlo. "And you, tell me your name?" Marlo tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether she should answer at all. "Marlo. Marlo Chen." Brennan nodded. He was going to remember that name. After everything that had happened, Brennan couldn't sleep. He stood by the window of the medical room inside the mansion, looking out at the darkness as it slowly gave way to the gray light of dawn over Los Angeles. The Reeves mansion sat atop a Beverly Hills hill like a cold fortress, with high walls, iron gates, and surveillance cameras everywhere. This was the safest place Brennan could bring his mother to, but that safety couldn't drive away the anxiety that was gnawing at him with every passing second. Helena lay on the hospital bed, breathing steadily beneath the watch of the heart monitor. The family's private physician, Dr. Yates, had arrived the moment he was called. He examined the wound on Helena's shoulder, then stopped and frowned. His gloved hands moved lightly over the neat line of stitching on her skin. "Who stitched this wound?" Dr. Yates asked, unable to hide his surprise. "Clean, precise, every stitch perfectly even. More professional than mine, and I've been doing this for 30 years. Brennan didn't answer. He only stood there, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on his mother. Dr. Yates continued the examination. A few minutes later, he stood up, his expression thoughtful. "The shoulder wound is stable. Whoever stitched it did an excellent job, stopped the bleeding in time, and prevented infection. But there's another issue." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Helena has suffered a head injury. It's not severe enough to be life-threatening, but she's fallen into a light coma. Her brain will need time to recover." "How long?" Brennan asked, his voice rough. "It could be a few days. It could be a few weeks. No one can know for certain." Dr. Yates let out a weary breath. "All we can do is wait and hope." Brennan hated waiting, hated hope. He was a man of action, a man of control, a man who kept everything in his hands. But in the face of his mother's condition, he was helpless as a child. Dr. Yates left after giving detailed instructions for her care. Brennan stayed behind. He pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down, one hand gripping the edge of the bed so tightly his knuckles whitened. His eyes never left his mother's face through the entire night. Helena looked peaceful in her sleep, as if she were only resting after a long day. But Brennan knew the truth wasn't that simple. His mother was fighting somewhere beyond his reach, in a place he couldn't touch. Near dawn, the door opened softly. Keith stepped inside with a file in his hand. The face of Brennan's most trusted bodyguard showed the fatigue of a night spent investigating, but his eyes were still sharp. "Boss, I finished checking the girl's background." Keith placed the file on the table. Marlo Chen, full name Marlo Chen Whitfield, 27 years old, a clinical nutrition specialist working at UCLA Public Hospital. She's lived alone in an apartment in Skid Row since she was 18. Brennan picked up the file and turned through the pages. Photo, address, educational history, work record. Everything was there. No criminal record, Keith continued. No debts, no ties to any family, including Blackwood. Low salary, low spending, uses most of her money to buy medicine and nutritional supplements. He paused. "She's clean, boss. There's nothing suspicious." Brennan looked at the photograph in the file. Marlo in a pale blue hospital uniform, round-faced, no makeup, her hair twisted into a neat bun at the back of her head. And those eyes looking straight into the camera, without avoidance, without posing, exactly the way she had looked at him last night. He remembered the 12 women who had come to this mansion over the years, girls sent by wealthy families with the hope of becoming Mrs. Brennan Reeves, beautiful as paintings, delicate as morning mist, 18-inch waists, skin white as porcelain, smiling sweetly, speaking gently, and not a single one of them had ever dared look him in the eye for more than 3 seconds. Marlo was different, completely different. "Anything else?" Brennan asked, still staring at the photograph. Keith hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether he should say it. "There's one detail. It doesn't seem related to us, but I think you should know." "Say it." She has a strange habit. Every Friday night, no matter what the weather is like, she brings medicine and food to hand out to the homeless in Skid Row. She's done it for 4 years, hasn't missed a single week. Keith paused. People in the neighborhood call it Linda Knight. Linda was her birth mother's name. She died 15 years ago. Brennan said nothing. Linda Knight. She had named the night she handed out charity medicine after her dead mother. What did her mother do? He asked. She was a nurse, worked at a public hospital, cared for poor patients. She died of a serious illness when Marlo was 12. Brennan set the file down. 4 years, 52 weeks a year, more than 200 Friday nights. That girl had walked out of her home carrying bags of medicine and food, entering the most dangerous neighborhood in Los Angeles to help people no one cared about. Not for money, not for fame, only because it was the way she chose to remember the mother she had lost. He had never met anyone like that. In his world, people did everything for gain. Kindness was a luxury no one could afford. But this girl, living in a miserable apartment on a meager salary, had spent 4 years of her life giving without asking anything in return. Keep watching her, Brennan said, his voice low, but from a distance. Don't let her know. Keith nodded and left the room. Brennan turned back to look at his mother. She still lay there in silence, breathing evenly. The heart monitor continued its steady beep, beep, beep. Marlo, Chen, Whitfield, Linda, Knight. Those 2 names kept echoing in his mind. Who was she? Why had she appeared at exactly that moment, in exactly that place? Why had she saved a stranger without asking a single question? And why couldn't he stop thinking about those calm, unshaken eyes? He didn't have the answers. Not yet, but he was going to find them. The next morning, Brennan summoned experts. If Dr. Yates couldn't do anything more than wait, then he would find someone who could. Money wasn't the problem. Time was the one thing he didn't have. The first to arrive was Dr. Whitney Ashford, the private physician of the Beverly Hills elite, $50,000 a week, with a client list made up entirely of names that appeared in Forbes magazine. She walked into the Reeves mansion as if she were stepping onto a red carpet. A costly designer dress clung to her slender body. Her golden hair had been styled to perfection, not a single strand out of place. 12-centimeter heels struck a rhythm against the marble floor. The scent of Chanel drifted softly through the hallway. Whitney followed Brennan into the medical room. She looked at Helena lying on the bed, looked at the wound on her shoulder that had already been bandaged, looked at the monitoring devices sounding their steady beep, beep, beep. Then her face went pale. Her perfectly painted lips began to tremble. I can't work under these conditions," Whitney stammered, stepping back as if Helena were the source of some contagious disease. "She needs a specialist hospital. She needs a sterile operating room. She needs a full medical team. I can't take responsibility if something goes wrong." "You were hired to treat illness, not to offer opinions," Brennan cut in, his voice as cold as a blade slicing through flesh. Whitney trembled. She looked at Brennan with frightened blue eyes, like a doe caught in the direct glare of headlights. I'm sorry. I can't. This case is beyond my ability." She hurriedly lowered her head and backed out of the room, the sharp tap of her heels against the floor sounding like the frantic pounding of a terrified heart. Brennan watched her retreating figure disappear through the door. $50,000 a week, a graduate of the most prestigious medical school in America, a doctor for the richest people in the city. But when faced with a patient who truly needed help, she ran, not because she lacked skill, because she was afraid. Afraid of responsibility, afraid of failure, afraid of anything that threatened her perfect reputation. The second arrived at noon, Dr. Morgan Steele. Not a real doctor, but a nutrition expert famous on social media. 2 million followers, dozens of videos about detoxing and cleansing the body. A face that appeared on every television program about health. Morgan entered with the confidence of someone long accustomed to being admired. She was painfully thin, her jawbone jutting out in sharp angles, dressed in expensive form-fitting athletic wear. She gave Helena a quick glance, then turned to Brennan with the polished smile of someone who had practiced it 1,000 times in front of a mirror. "I understand the issue now," Morgan declared, her voice brimming with confidence, as though she had just solved a difficult equation. "Her body is accumulating toxins. That's the reason her brain can't recover. She needs a detox. 3 days of fasting to cleanse the body will help her cells regenerate and—" "Get out," Brennan cut in. Morgan blinked, her smile freezing on her lips. But my method has been proven effective for millions of people. If you'll just give me a chance. Get out. Brennan's voice wasn't loud, but it was so cold that the air in the room seemed to harden into ice. Morgan went pale, swallowed hard, then hurried out even faster than Whitney had. Brennan stood alone beside his mother's bed. The room had fallen into a silence so deep it was almost suffocating. Only the steady sound of the heart monitor remained, reminding him that his mother was still there, still fighting. Two people, two experts considered the best in their fields. Two utterly useless answers. One ran because she was afraid of responsibility. One proposed an idiotic method that might kill his mother even faster. These were the people the upper class trusted? These were the people paid tens of thousands of dollars every week? He thought of the girl in the miserable apartment in Skid Row, Marlo Chen Whitfield, the one without a degree from some prestigious medical school, without 2 million followers on social media, without expensive dresses or 12-centimeter heels, only rough hands and calm eyes. Yet she had done what these self-proclaimed experts hadn't dared do. She had acted. She had saved his mother with ordinary needle and thread in a filthy apartment, without anesthetic, without a tremor in her hands. Dr. Yates had said her stitching was more professional than his after 30 years of experience. The file showed that she was a clinical nutrition specialist, not someone selling detox drinks online. She lived in the slums, yet had spent 4 years saving people without asking anything in return. Brennan turned to Keith, who had been standing silently in the corner of the room. "Take me to her." Keith nodded without asking another question. He had been with Brennan long enough to know when the boss had made a decision, and when it was wiser not to wonder why. Brennan looked at his mother one last time before leaving. The people who were perfect by society's standards were all useless. The one he needed was the girl this entire city looked down on, and he was going to find her. Brennan stood in front of Marlo's apartment door, alone. No bodyguards, no gun in his hand, just him, standing in the dark hallway of an aging building in Skid Row, a place where men like him never set foot. He had told Keith to wait downstairs in the car. This was a conversation he needed to have alone, not because he trusted the girl, but because he needed her to trust him. Brennan knocked. The soft sound of footsteps came from inside. Then the door opened. Marlo stood there, still dressed in wrinkled sleepwear, her hair loose and tangled over her shoulders. Her eyes were red and stinging from lack of sleep, dark circles heavy beneath them. But she didn't look surprised to see him. She didn't panic. She didn't step back. She just stood there, looking at him with the same calm expression, as if a mafia boss appearing at her door early in the morning were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You found my address pretty fast," she said, her voice still rough from sleep. "I find everything I want," Brennan replied. "Then what do you want?" Brennan was silent for a moment. He wasn't used to asking. His whole life, other people had begged him. Enemies begged for mercy. Partners begged for alliances. Women begged to stay by his side. Never once had he needed to open his mouth and ask anyone for anything. But now, for his mother, he was willing to do anything, even swallow his pride. "My mother hasn't woken up," he said, his voice low. "The doctors say to wait. I don't have time to wait." Marlo leaned against the doorframe, folding her arms across her chest. She didn't invite him inside. She didn't act afraid or flattering. She only stood there, looking at him as if she were deciding whether he was worth listening to at all. "And you think I can do what?" she asked. "I'm not some miracle doctor. I don't have an operating room or expensive medical equipment. I'm just a nutrition specialist working in a public hospital for a starvation salary. You stitched my mother's shoulder with ordinary needle and thread without anesthesia." "She didn't make a sound," Brennan said, remembering Dr. Yates's words. "My private doctor said those stitches were more professional than his after 30 years of experience. You know something they don't know." Marlo looked at him, looked for a long time. Her brown eyes didn't avoid him, didn't waver, as if she were looking through the cold shell he wore, straight into whatever lay beneath it. And then she spoke, her voice as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. "I know how to wake someone from a coma through nutrition and sensory stimulation. It's not magic. It's not a miracle. It's just knowledge of the human body that modern medicine often overlooks." Brennan felt his heart begin to beat faster. Hope. Something he had forgotten the feeling of a long time ago. "But," Marlo continued, and that one word stopped him cold, "I need time. Not a few hours or a day. It could be a few weeks. I need space to work in my own way, and I need no one interfering with my methods. No doctor standing behind me telling me what to do. No one asking why I'm doing this instead of that. Can you give me those things? You'll have everything you need, Brennan answered without hesitation. Money, equipment, supplies, anything. I don't need your money, Marlowe cut in, her voice sharp as glass. I need you to step aside and let me work. Brennan clenched his jaw. Step aside. Let someone else take control. That wasn't the way he lived. That wasn't the way he survived in this world. One more condition, Marlowe said, looking straight into his eyes. Her eyes held no fear, no pleading, only the hardness of someone who had grown used to being treated badly by life and no longer had anything left to lose. If I fail, you don't get to hurt me. I don't work with a gun pointed at me. I don't work with a blade at my throat. If you can't accept that, then you can go back to your mansion and find someone else. Brennan stood motionless. No one placed conditions on him. No one ever had. In his world, he was the one who made the rules. He was the one who decided who lived and who died. He was the one holding every card. But this girl living in a miserable apartment on a meager salary, this girl the whole of Los Angeles looked down on, was standing in front of him and laying out terms as if she were the one with the power. And the strange thing was that he wasn't angry. He was surprised. He was impressed. And he understood that she was the only one who could save his mother, because she was the only one unafraid enough to tell him the truth. He nodded. All right, one word, a single word, but it weighed more than any contract he had ever signed, more than any promise he had ever given, because for the first time in his life, Brennan Reeves, the man who never yielded, was accepting someone else's terms. Marlowe looked at him for one more second, as if deciding whether his word could be trusted. Then she gave a faint nod. Give me 10 minutes, she said, then turned and walked back into the apartment. Brennan stood there, staring at the door as it closed in front of him. 10 minutes. She didn't ask him in to sit and wait. She didn't offer him water. She didn't try to please him. She simply told him to wait, and he waited. He, Brennan Reeves, was standing in the dark hallway of a building in the slums, waiting for a girl he had met only once. If anyone had told him a week ago that this would happen, he would have laughed in their face. But now he didn't laugh. He waited. Because his mother needed this girl, and maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to need her too. Marlowe stepped into the Reeves mansion and immediately felt the difference between two worlds. Her apartment in Skid Row could have fit inside this living room. The polished marble floor reflected the light of crystal chandeliers hanging from the soaring ceiling. Paintings by artists she had only ever seen in books covered the walls. Cool air drifted from the central climate system, carrying the faint scent of fresh flowers arranged in costly porcelain vases. Cold, luxurious, and full of contemptuous eyes. She saw everything. The bodyguards in black suits standing along the hallway, their eyes sweeping over her from head to toe, looking at the hair she had twisted up in haste, looking at the plain clothes she was wearing, looking at the old sneakers faded with wear. She didn't need to hear their thoughts to know exactly what they were thinking. Why did the boss bring this one here? Who was she? A new servant? A cheap little plaything? Or just some lucky nobody? Marlowe didn't care. She had lived with looks like that all her life. From her stepmother, from her younger sister, from co-workers at the hospital, from wealthy patients who thought she was too fat to understand nutrition. Those looks didn't hurt anymore. They were only background noise now, something she had learned how to ignore. Keith led her through endless hallways before finally stopping in front of a heavy oak door, the mansion's private medical room. When the door opened, Marlowe saw Helena lying on the hospital bed, surrounded by expensive medical equipment the public hospital where she worked could only dream of having. And standing beside the bed was a silver-haired man in a white coat, Dr. Yates. He turned at the sound of the door, and when he saw Marlowe, his eyes swept over her with the kind of look people reserved for a stain on an expensive Persian rug. "Who is this?" Dr. Yates asked, his voice making no effort to hide his contempt. Brennan stepped in behind Marlowe, his tone even. "The person who's going to treat my mother." Dr. Yates let out a mocking laugh, the laugh of a man used to being respected, a man who couldn't believe what he had just heard. Her? This one? He looked Marlowe up and down again, this time more slowly, more carefully, as if inspecting damaged merchandise. She doesn't even look capable of taking care of herself, and she's supposed to treat someone else? Marlowe didn't answer. She didn't look at Dr. Yates. She didn't waste time explaining or defending herself. Instead, she walked straight to Helena's bedside, dismissing the doctor as if he were nothing more than an invisible piece of furniture. She took Helena's wrist and checked her pulse. Then she gently lifted one eyelid and used a small flashlight to examine her pupils. She observed Helena's fingernails, her skin tone, her breathing rhythm. Every movement was precise, focused, without a second wasted. "She's not in a deep coma," Marlowe said, her voice as calm as if she were reading from a report. "Her brain is still active. Her pupils respond to light. There's rapid eye movement during sleep. Her basic reflexes are still there. With the right stimulation, she'll wake up." Dr. Yates laughed, cold and dripping with scorn. "Nonsense. I'm a doctor with 20 years of experience. I've examined Mrs. Helena from the beginning. This is a coma caused by head trauma, and the brain needs time to recover on its own. There's no way to force the brain to wake up any faster." Marlowe turned to look at him. For the first time since entering the room, she looked directly into Dr. Yates's eyes. Her brown eyes held no anger, no irritation, only the cool calm of someone stating a simple and obvious fact. 20 years of experience and you didn't realize she was suffering from severe hypoglycemia before the stroke, she said, her tone even, as if she were asking about the weather. "Look at her fingernails. There are horizontal ridges. Look at the paleness of her skin and the slight tremors in her hands. Those are signs of severe hypoglycemia that often precede a collapse. Those are signs of long-term malnutrition and unstable blood sugar, basic signs that any first-year medical student would recognize." Dr. Yates went pale. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. He looked down at Helena's fingernails, at the color of her skin, and for the first time in 20 years of practice, he couldn't find a single word of rebuttal. Brennan stood at the door, watching everything in silence. He looked at Dr. Yates, the man he had paid tens of thousands of dollars every month, now standing there with a face gone white, as if he had just been struck. And he looked at Marlowe, the girl everyone in that room looked down on, standing there as calm as if she had just spoken the most obvious truth in the world. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. She didn't try to prove herself right. She simply spoke the truth. And that truth alone had been enough to bring down a doctor with 20 years of experience. "Let her work," Brennan said to Dr. Yates, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Get out." Dr. Yates looked at Brennan, then at Marlowe, then back at Brennan. He wanted to protest, wanted to say this was an insult, wanted to say he was the doctor and she was only a fat girl from the slums. But he didn't dare. No one dared defy Brennan Reeves in his own house. Dr. Yates lowered his head and walked out of the room, his shoulders bent like a man who had just lost a battle and didn't understand how he had lost it. When the door closed, Marlowe turned to Brennan. "I need a list of everything she's eaten in the past month, and I need access to the kitchen." Brennan nodded. "You'll have everything." Marlowe didn't thank him. She simply turned back to Helena, her eyes fully focused on the patient. She had stepped into the tiger's den, a place where everyone looked down on her. But she didn't care. She had only one goal, to wake the woman lying in that bed. And she was going to do it, whatever it cost. Marlowe began working the moment Dr. Yates left the room. She didn't waste a single second celebrating that small victory. Helena was still in a coma, and every passing hour mattered. She handed Keith a long list of things that needed to be bought. The bodyguard stared at the sheet of paper with a bewildered expression, as if he were reading some alien language. Strange ingredients the million-dollar kitchen in the Reeves mansion had never even heard of. Herbs the luxury supermarkets in Beverly Hills didn't carry. Things that could only be found in little shops scattered through Chinatown, Little Saigon, and Koreatown across Los Angeles. Keith looked over at Brennan, waiting for confirmation. Brennan only nodded. "Do exactly what she says." And so the bodyguards of the most powerful mafia family in Los Angeles had to race all over the city like delivery men, searching for fresh mountain ginger, whole turmeric roots, and dozens of other herbs whose names they couldn't even pronounce. Brennan didn't ask why. He only stood outside the door of the medical room, watching Marlowe work. A few hours later, the scent of herbs began to spread through the mansion. The sharp heat of ginger, the warm earthiness of turmeric, the smell of things no one could name, yet somehow they felt familiar and comforting. The cold mansion, once filled only with the fragrance of expensive perfume and disinfectant, now carried the faint scent of life, of hope, of something deeply human. Marlowe cooked porridge in the million-dollar kitchen, a kitchen the family's private chef had never used for anything except refined French and Italian dishes. She stood by the stove for hours, stirring her special pot of porridge, adding each ingredient in an order only she understood. There was no written recipe, no instruction book. It was all in her head, passed down from her grandmother, who had learned it from her own mother, and so on, reaching back through hundreds of years. When the porridge was done, Marlowe brought it to Helena's room. She fed it to her one tiny spoonful at a time, through a special tube, patiently waiting for the body's natural swallowing reflex. One spoonful. Wait. One more spoonful. Wait. The process lasted for hours, but Marlowe never showed the slightest impatience. After that came massage. Marlowe pressed on the pressure points in Helena's hands, on her legs, on her head, slow, patient movements, as though she were speaking to Helena's body in the language of touch. Her large, rough hands moved with astonishing precision, finding every exact point, applying every exact amount of pressure. She played soft music by Helena's bedside, flowing classical piano pieces, and she spoke to Helena as if she were fully awake. "Ma'am, the weather is beautiful today. Warm sunshine and a gentle breeze." Marlowe's voice was tender, warm, completely different from the cutting chill she had used against Dr. Yates. "Your son is waiting for you to wake up. He's so worried, you know that? Don't make him wait too long. He needs you." Brennan stood outside the door, silently watching. He didn't step in. He didn't disturb her. He only stood there, watching the girl from the slums care for his mother with a devotion none of the expensive doctors had ever possessed. 18 hours a day. That was how much time Marlowe gave to Helena. She barely slept, barely rested, never complained once. When Brennan forced her to eat, she ate quickly and went right back to work. When he told her to rest, she only shook her head and kept going. Sweat soaked through her clothes, but her hands never stopped moving. Her eyes were red from exhaustion, yet they remained completely focused on the patient. The first day passed. Nothing changed. The second day, Helena still lay still, breathing steadily, with no response. Then the third day came. Marlowe was massaging Helena's hand as usual, the familiar movements she had repeated hundreds of times over those 3 days. And then she felt something, a small change, very small, so small that anyone else might have missed it. Helena's finger moved, just a little, a tiny movement, like the touch of a butterfly's wing against a flower petal, but it was real, unmistakably real. Marlowe held her breath. Her heart pounded hard inside her chest. She didn't dare believe what she had just felt. She looked down at Helena's hand, waiting, hoping. Then she looked up and saw Brennan standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word. He didn't move, but his eyes, the cold eyes of the most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles, were fixed tightly on his mother's hand. He had seen it too. He had felt it too. For the first time since that fateful night, Marlowe saw something in Brennan's eyes she had never expected to find. Hope. On the 6th night, the Reeves mansion was silent as the grave. Not a single sound except the night wind moving through the tall trees in the garden. 3 o'clock in the morning, that hour when even the bodyguards on the night shift began to nod off in the darkness. Marlowe sat alone on the stone steps outside in the garden. She had left Helena's room after making sure she was sleeping peacefully. 6 days. 6 days without enough sleep. 6 days of working 18 hours straight. Her body was so exhausted that every bone in her seemed to ache, yet her mind refused to stop turning. She couldn't sleep. Not because she was worried about Helena, but because old thoughts, old memories, old wounds were slowly crawling out of the dark corners of her mind. The phone in her pocket vibrated. Marlowe looked at the screen, and her heart sank when she saw the familiar name. A name she didn't want to see. A name that always came with pain. Paige, her half-sister. Marlowe opened the message, even though she knew she shouldn't. "Hey, fat sister, I'm getting married. The wedding's in the Maldives, full of celebrities. Don't come, okay? I don't want the guests thinking my family has bad genes." There was a kissing emoji attached, along with a photograph. Paige in a magnificent wedding gown, her waist impossibly tiny, her skin white as porcelain, her golden hair styled to flawless perfection. Beside her stood a handsome young man, clearly from money, with a bright white smile and an expensive suit. They were standing before the blue sea beneath the glow of sunset, looking as though they had stepped straight out of a fashion magazine cover. Marlo looked at the picture. She wasn't jealous. She didn't care about Paige's lavish wedding, or the handsome man, or the perfect life her sister was showing off. None of that meant anything to her, but that photograph, that magnificent wedding gown, made her think of someone else, her mother. Her mother had never gotten to wear a beautiful dress. Her mother had never had a lavish wedding in the Maldives. Her mother had spent her whole life working as a nurse in a public hospital, caring for the poor, coming home with a meager paycheck and legs aching from exhaustion. And when her mother left this world, she had lain on a cheap hospital bed, in a faded patient gown that had been washed hundreds of times. No flowers, no music, no one beside her except a 12-year-old girl sobbing her heart out. Her mother had deserved to live, deserved to be happy, deserved to wear a beautiful dress, to smile brightly beneath the evening sky, to have a life that wasn't made entirely of sacrifice and suffering. But fate hadn't allowed it. Fate had given her mother only illness, poverty, and a lonely death in the night. The tears began to fall. Marlo couldn't stop them. She cried, silently. Her shoulders shook in waves as if something inside her were being torn apart. Her hand clamped over her mouth to keep any sob from escaping. She was used to hiding pain, used to crying alone in the dark, used to never letting anyone see her weak. The darkness in the garden shifted. Marlo lifted her head, quickly wiping at her tears, and she saw Brennan stepping out from somewhere in the shadows, like a ghost taking form. He didn't say anything, didn't ask why she was there, didn't ask why she was crying. He only walked over and sat down beside her on the freezing stone steps. Marlo waited for a question, waited for curiosity, waited for the empty words of comfort she had heard too many times in her life. But nothing came. Brennan simply sat there, silent, looking out at the dark garden. No questions, no words, just presence. And strangely enough, that silence was exactly what Marlo needed most. She kept crying, no longer trying to hide it. Her shoulders trembled, the tears kept falling, and Brennan remained there, silent as a stone statue. The two of them sat side by side in the darkness, not touching, not looking at each other, yet somehow closer than they had ever been before. Nearly 2 hours later, Marlo stopped crying. She had run out of tears, out of strength, out of everything. She turned to look at Brennan, her eyes swollen red, her face streaked and wet. "You're not going to ask why I was crying." Brennan looked at her. Moonlight rested on his face, softening the sharpness of his features. His voice was low and gentle, no longer cold the way it usually was. Pain doesn't need an explanation. It just needs someone beside it. Marlo looked at him, looked for a long time, and for the first time since meeting this mafia boss, she didn't see a monster in his eyes anymore. She saw a man who was full of wounds too, just as lonely, just as determined to hide his pain behind a cold shell. Like her. Very much like her. They didn't say anything more. They simply sat there, two figures in the darkness, seeing each other truly for the first time. Not through masks, not through prejudice, just two human beings carrying wounds no one else could see. Helena was showing clear signs of progress. Her eyes sometimes moved beneath her lids, as if she were dreaming long and distant dreams. Her hand would curl when Marlo spoke to her, her weak fingers tightening softly around Marlo's hand as though she were trying to answer. They were tiny signs, but to Marlo, they were an entire world of hope. On the 8th night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, the $1 million kitchen in the Reeves mansion stood empty, lit only by the gentle yellow glow of the hanging lamp above the island. Marlo stood at the stove, preparing porridge for Helena's breakfast the next morning. She had grown used to sleepless nights, used to working in silence while the rest of the world drifted in dreams. The soft sound of footsteps came from behind her. Marlo didn't turn around. She had already come to recognize those footsteps from the nights before. Brennan. He stayed up late often, wandering through the mansion like a ghost that couldn't find its place of rest. Brennan walked into the kitchen and said nothing. He pulled out a chair and sat down on the other side of the island, across from Marlo. She kept stirring the porridge, and he kept silent. The two of them were in the same room, yet it felt as though they existed in separate worlds. Then Brennan spoke. His voice was low. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the marble countertop. "My father fell in front of me. I was 22. Marlo stopped her hand. She didn't turn around, but all her attention had shifted to that voice. "We were having dinner," Brennan continued, his tone flat, as if he were telling someone else's story, a story he had tried to separate himself from so he wouldn't have to feel the pain. My birthday. My mother had prepared a small dinner, just the three of us, my father, my mother, and me. He told me he was proud of me. It was the first time he had ever said that. He paused and drew in a deep breath. Then 3 shots came through the glass door. I didn't have time to react. By the time I understood what was happening, my father was already in my arms. My hands were soaked. He was getting colder. Marlo turned to look at Brennan. He still wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on empty space, as if he were staring back into that night, reliving every terrible second. He looked at me and said, "Protect your mother. Trust no one." Brennan's voice caught for the briefest moment, then returned to that frightening calmness. Then he was gone, right there in my arms. I felt the moment he stopped breathing. He fell silent for a long while. The kitchen sank into stillness, with only the faint sound of the porridge simmering on the stove. "It's been 10 years, Brennan said, his voice like a quiet exhale. 10 years of not letting anyone get close, because my father said trust no one. And I kept that promise. With everyone." Marlo turned off the stove. She walked to the island and sat down in the chair across from Brennan. For a moment, she said nothing. She just looked at the man in front of her. The most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles, the man the whole city trembled before, was sitting here now with the face of a 22-year-old boy who had just lost his father. Then she spoke, her voice gentle. "My mother died when I was 12. Brennan lifted his head, and for the first time, looked straight into her eyes. "A serious illness. During the last 6 months, I stayed with her every day after school," Marlo said, her voice steady, though her eyes were beginning to shine. "I cooked porridge myself and brought it to the hospital because the food there was so terrible. Every day, I thought that if I did well enough, if the porridge tasted good enough, if I took care of her carefully enough, she would get better." She lowered her head and looked down at her hands. "One night, I fell asleep beside her bed. I was too tired. When I woke up, my mother's hand was already cold." Her voice tightened. "I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to tell her I loved her. She died alone while I was sleeping right there beside her." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall, as if she were too tired to keep hiding anymore. "That's why I started Linda Night. Every Friday I bring medicine and food to the homeless, because my mother spent her whole life taking care of other people. And I think that if I keep doing her work, somehow, she's still alive." Brennan looked at her, not with the eyes of a master looking at someone who worked for him, not with the eyes of a mafia boss looking at someone beneath him, but with the eyes of a person who was seeing himself in someone else. 2 wounds, 2 griefs, 2 children who had lost someone they loved and never truly recovered. "So you understand," he said, his voice rough, "why I need my mother to wake up?" Marlo nodded. She understood, more than anyone else in this world could, because she had once been the 12-year-old child sitting beside her mother's bed, praying for a miracle that never came. "I won't let you lose someone you love the way I did," she said, her voice trembling softly but steady all the same. "I promise." Brennan looked at her, and in his eyes, Marlo saw something she had never expected. Trust. For the first time in 10 years, the mafia boss had broken the promise he made to his father. For the first time, he allowed himself to trust someone. On the morning of the 9th day, the early sunlight slipped through the narrow gap in Helena's curtains, painting golden streaks across the wooden floor. It was a peaceful morning like any other, yet Marlo had a feeling that today would be different. She sat beside Helena's bed, massaging pressure points in her hands the way she had done for the past 9 days. Her hands moved slowly, pressing each point in Helena's palm with the patience she had forged through thousands of hours of work. And as always, she sang, a small lullaby. The lullaby her mother had once sung to her when she was little, when she was sick, when she was afraid, when she needed someone to remind her that she wasn't alone. Marlo didn't have a beautiful singing voice. She knew that. But she sang anyway, because this wasn't a performance. This was a whisper to a sleeping soul. A fragile thread connecting this world to the place where Helena had been drifting. Suddenly, Helena's fingers tightened. Marlo froze. She had felt small movements before, those moments when Helena's fingers had twitched as lightly as butterfly wings. But this time was different, stronger, clearer, as if Helena were trying to grasp something, trying to hold onto a thread and pull herself back. Marlowe's heart pounded inside her chest. She held her breath, afraid to move, afraid that even the slightest action might shatter this moment. She kept singing, trying to hold her voice steady even though her hands were trembling. Then Helena opened her eyes, slowly, with effort, like someone waking from a very long, very deep sleep, a place where time had stopped meaning anything at all. Her eyelids fluttered as she struggled to adjust to the light. The morning sun seemed too bright, too harsh after 9 days spent in darkness. Marlowe stopped singing. Tears had already begun to run down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She only sat there, looking at Helena, waiting. Helena blinked a few more times. Her eyes, once clouded and empty, were slowly filling with life again. She looked around the room, at the ceiling, at the medical equipment surrounding her. Then her gaze settled on Marlowe. A strange woman, eyes full of tears, sitting beside her bed with both hands still wrapped around hers. "Who are you?" Helena whispered, her voice hoarse, as though it hadn't been used in years. Marlowe smiled, a trembling smile blurred by tears. "I'm the one who's bringing you back to your son." Then she turned and called out loudly, "Brennan!" The sound of hurried footsteps rang out in the hallway, fast, urgent, as if the person running had been waiting for this moment through 9 endless days and couldn't bear to wait 1 second longer. Brennan rushed into the room. His eyes were wide with alarm, braced for the worst. And then he stopped cold in the doorway. His mother's eyes were open. She was looking at him. "Brennan," Helena whispered, her voice weak but full of love. The Mafia boss stood there for 1 second, then 2, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, as if he were afraid this was only a dream, and if he moved, it would disappear. Then he stepped to the bedside. His legs looked unsteady, as though all the strength he had forced himself to carry for the past 10 years had suddenly fallen away. He sank to his knees beside his mother's bed, his hand closing tightly around hers, his head bowed low, and his shoulders began to shake. Brennan Reeves, the most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles, the man who made an entire city tremble, the man who never cried, never showed weakness, never let anyone see him shake. He was crying, for the first time in 10 years. Since the night his father had fallen in his arms, since the night he had sworn he would never be weak again, since the night he had built a wall around his heart, that wall came down. He cried like the 22-year-old boy he had once been, the boy who had lost his father and nearly lost his mother too. He cried as if all the tears he had held back for an entire decade were pouring out now, unstoppable at last. His shoulders shook, sobs caught in his throat, and his hand clung to his mother's as if he feared she would disappear the moment he let go. Helena lifted her other hand and, trembling, touched her son's hair. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice still weak but filled with love. "I'm not going anywhere." Marlowe stood in the corner of the room, quietly wiping away her own tears. She looked at the two of them, and her heart felt both warm and aching. She thought of her own mother, thought of the night she had fallen asleep beside that hospital bed, thought of the cold hand she had woken to, thought of the goodbye she had never gotten to say. She hadn't been able to save her own mother. That was the wound she had carried for 15 years, the wound that had never healed. But today, at least, she had saved someone else's mother. She had kept her promise to Brennan. She had done the thing she had always wished she could have done for her own mother. Helena turned to look at her, then back at her son. "Who saved me?" she asked, her voice still rough and fragile. Brennan lifted his head. His eyes were red, tears still shining on his face. The most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles looked like a child who had just found the most precious thing he had believed was lost forever. "She did, Mother," he said, his voice breaking, his eyes turning toward Marlowe. "She saved you." In the days that followed, Helena slowly recovered. Color returned to her face, shifting from pale and drained to warm with life again. Her voice grew stronger, changing from weak whispers into clear and complete sentences. She was still fragile, still in need of rest, but she was awake, and her eyes, the eyes of a woman who had survived hell, began to observe everything around her with astonishing sharpness. Most of all, she watched Marlowe, the strange woman who had saved her life. The woman her son looked at with a gaze that had changed. The woman who still came to her room every day, cooking porridge, massaging her hands, talking to her, as if taking care of Helena were the most important work in the world. Helena watched the way Marlowe worked, devoted, patient. Never a single complaint. She watched the way she treated other people. Polite to the bodyguards even when they looked at her with contempt. Calm in the face of Dr. Yates's sarcastic remarks, never trying to impress anyone or win favor. And she watched the way her son looked at her. Brennan's eyes, when they rested on Marlowe, were no longer cold the way they were with everyone else. One afternoon, when Marlowe brought porridge into the room, Helena called her over. "Sit down here, child." Marlowe hesitated, looking at the chair beside the bed. She had sat there hundreds of times over the past 9 days, but this was different. This time Helena wasn't lying there still and motionless. This time she was looking at Marlowe with clear, sharp, fully awake eyes. Marlowe sat down. "Child," Helena said again, and that one word made Marlowe go still. Child. Not miss. Not Marlowe. But child. It had been a very long time since anyone had called her that. Since her mother had died, no one had called her child with that kind of gentleness. "Do you have family?" Helena asked, her voice soft, but her eyes were watching Marlowe closely, as if reading every line written in the book of her life. Marlowe shook her head. "My mother died a long time ago. My father remarried." She stopped, swallowing the tightness in her throat. "I don't belong to that family anymore." Helena was silent for a moment. She didn't ask more. She didn't pry into the details. She didn't show the kind of pity Marlowe hated with all her heart. She only gave a faint nod, as if she understood everything without needing to hear another word. Then she spoke, her voice low and distant, as if looking back into the past. "I was once cast aside too." Marlowe looked at her in surprise. Helena Reeves, the mother of the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles, the woman who lived in a $1 million mansion guarded by an army of bodyguards, had once been cast aside? "I was born in poverty," Helena continued. "No proper education, no position, nothing at all. When I married into the Reeves family, my husband's relatives looked at me the way people look at a speck of dust blown into a high society party. They thought I would stain their noble bloodline." Marlowe sat in silence, listening. She had never expected the woman before her to have a past that felt so much like her own. "But now you are," she began, then stopped, unsure what word would fit. Helena smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had fought and won. "Now I am the most powerful woman in this family. The ones who once looked down on me now lower their heads when they see me. I proved them wrong." She looked straight into Marlowe's eyes. "Not by changing who I was, not by trying to become what they wanted, but by becoming impossible to replace." She reached out and took Marlowe's hand. Her hand was still weak, but warm and steady. "You saved my life," Helena said, her voice gentle, the way a mother might speak to her own daughter. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to me, not to Brennan, not to anyone in this house." She gave Marlowe's hand a soft squeeze. "But if you want, I'll stand beside you, like a mother." Marlowe lowered her head. Tears began to fall, landing on Helena's hand. She didn't try to stop them. She couldn't. So many years of loneliness. So many years with no one to lean on. So many years of telling herself she didn't need a family. All of it broke open in that one moment. This was the first time in 15 years that anyone had called her child, and truly meant it. This was the first time she had felt that she belonged somewhere. Not because she had tried hard enough. Not because she had changed herself. But because someone accepted her exactly as she was. "Thank you," Marlowe whispered, her voice thick with tears. Helena smiled and lifted a hand to wipe the tears from her cheek. "Don't thank me. This is family. Family doesn't need thanks." Marlowe continued caring for Helena during her recovery. Every day, she cooked nourishing porridge, massaged pressure points, and talked with her for hours. Helena grew stronger by the day. She could already sit up in bed, even take a few steps around the room with Marlowe's support. But something was still lodged in Marlowe's mind, a question she hadn't yet found the answer to. Why would a healthy woman like Helena suddenly suffer a stroke? One day, while they were talking, Marlowe decided to ask, "Ma'am, before you were attacked, did you notice anything unusual about your body? Unusual fatigue, headaches, dizziness?" Helena frowned, trying to remember. "Yes. About 2 months earlier, I started feeling more tired than usual. A dull headache. I thought it was just age. Did anything change in your diet? Any new medication? Supplements?" Helena thought for a moment. "Yes. A new chef started making a kind of herbal tea for me. Said it was good for my health, helped me sleep, and reduced stress. I drank it every night before bed. Marlo stopped what she was doing, and her eyes sharpened. A new chef? Who introduced this chef? Helena frowned again, trying to remember. One of Brennan's business associates. His name was Conrad Blackwood. He said the chef specialized in health cuisine and wanted to recommend him to me as a gift. Conrad Blackwood. Marlo fixed that name in her mind. Do you still have that tea in the kitchen? Probably. I haven't drunk it since the attack. Marlo rose to her feet at once. I'll be back. She went straight down to the kitchen and asked the staff to show her where the tea Helena had been drinking was stored. It was a beautiful tin box, covered with elegant labels full of words about organic herbs and ancient formulas. Marlo opened the tin and took out a small amount of the tea. She smelled it. The fragrance was pleasant, a blend of many herbs, most of them harmless: chamomile, licorice, mint. But there was another scent, very faint, almost impossible to detect unless someone had experience. The scent of an herb Marlo had learned about from her grandmother. She looked closely at the color of the tea leaves, examined their texture. Her face slowly paled as she realized what she was seeing. This wasn't ordinary tea. In this mixture was a poisonous herb, the kind that, in small doses over a long period of time, would weaken the blood vessels in the brain, not enough to be detected through routine tests, not enough to cause obvious symptoms right away. But after a few months, it would leave the victim at a risk of stroke many times higher than normal. Helena hadn't suffered a natural stroke. She had been poisoned slowly. The attack that night had only been the final act, to make certain she wouldn't survive. Marlo took the tea tin and went to find Brennan. She found him in his study, reading documents. The moment he saw her expression, Brennan stood up at once. What is it? Marlo set the tea tin on the desk and handed him the analysis she had carefully written out. Your mother was poisoned. This tea contains a toxic herb that weakens the blood vessels in the brain when taken over time. That's why she had the stroke. Brennan looked at the tin, then at the paper, then at Marlo. His face darkened like a storm about to break. His jaw tightened, and Marlo could see the muscles in his neck going rigid. Conrad Blackwood, he said, his voice cold as steel. Who is that? Marlo asked. My enemy. He's a mafia boss in San Francisco, trying to expand south. He wants control of the port of Long Beach, where I control the entire shipping operation. If my mother... Brennan stopped and swallowed hard. If my mother had died, I would have fallen apart, and he would have taken the opportunity to swallow everything. Marlo was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. She was standing in the middle of a war between mafia families, a world she had never imagined she would step into. Then she spoke, her voice so calm that even she was surprised by herself. I'll write down everything I found. The toxic component in the tea, the poisoning method, your mother's symptoms, everything. She looked straight into Brennan's eyes. And I'll send it to a friend I trust, just in case. Brennan looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. In case of what? In case I'm not here to testify, Marlo answered, her voice unwavering. If Conrad Blackwood knows I uncovered his scheme, he won't leave me alone. I need insurance. Brennan went still. He looked at Marlo with a new expression, the look of a man who had just realized something important. This girl wasn't only skilled in medicine and herbs. She was intelligent, sharp, able to think several steps ahead. She understood the dangerous world she was stepping into, and she had already prepared herself to survive it. She was far smarter than he had thought. I won't let anything happen to you, Brennan said, his voice low and certain. Marlo looked at him without wavering. I know you'll try, but I don't put my life in someone else's hands. Never. Conrad Blackwood knew Helena had awakened. News traveled fast in the underworld, and his eyes and ears were everywhere. The slow poisoning plan had failed. The ambush had failed too. The woman who should have been dead was now recovering, and her son, his greatest enemy, hadn't fallen apart at all. He was stronger than ever. But Conrad didn't give up. He hadn't become the mafia boss of San Francisco by surrendering when faced with obstacles. He had another card to play. A card he had prepared long ago, waiting for the right moment to use it. One day, Brennan received a package. No sender, no return address, just a black box left outside his study door, as though it had appeared out of thin air. Brennan opened the box. Inside was a USB drive, a stack of papers, and a small card with a handwritten line. You should know who's sleeping in your house. He plugged the USB into his computer. A video began to play, footage from 5 years earlier. Marlo, a little younger, a little thinner, standing inside a luxurious office. She was receiving a thick envelope from a man in an expensive suit. The man smiled and shook her hand. The camera captured both faces clearly. Brennan recognized the man, Marcus Webb, the personal lawyer of the Blackwood family. He flipped through the stack of papers. An apartment sale contract, signed by Marlo Chen Whitfield and Marcus Webb. The transaction amount, $80,000. Beneath the contract were screenshots of text messages, cold lines of words staring back at him. Mission: monitor and report the activities of the Reeves family. Get close to Helena Reeves. Await further orders. There was also a statement from the former chef, the man who had prepared the poisoned tea for his mother. She was the one who contacted me. She gave me that herb and instructed me how to mix it into the tea. Brennan looked at all of it. His hand began to shake. His heart felt as if someone were crushing it, twisting it, grinding it apart piece by piece. Everything fit together. Too well, too perfectly. The video, the contract, the messages, the statement, all of it pointed in one direction only. Marlo had been Blackwood's spy from the very beginning. He remembered his father's words, the last words he had spoken before dying in Brennan's arms. Trust no one. For 10 years he had kept that promise. For 10 years he had let no one get close. For 10 years he had built a wall around his heart, solid and cold. Then she had appeared, the girl in the miserable apartment, the girl with the calm eyes and healing hands, the girl who had saved his mother, who had sat beside him in the dark, who had listened as he told her about the pain he had never shared with anyone. He had trusted her, completely, absolutely. He had let her into his house, to his mother's bedside, into his heart, and all of it had been a deception. Brennan stormed into Marlo's room and kicked the door open. His eyes were red, not from crying this time, but from the rage burning through him from the inside out. He still held the stack of papers in one hand, gripping them so tightly the pages were crumpled. Marlo was sitting at the table, writing something down. She looked up when she saw him, and at once she knew something was wrong. "Brennan, what happened?" He threw the papers down onto the table in front of her. "Explain this." Marlo looked down. She saw the video playing on his phone, saw the contract, saw the text messages, saw the statement. Her face went visibly pale. "Brennan, this isn't... You took money from Blackwood," he roared, his voice like thunder in a storm. $80,000. And you were the one who gave the poisoned herb to the chef. No. Marlo stood up, her eyes full of alarm, though her voice fought to stay calm. 5 years ago I sold the apartment my mother left me to pay hospital bills. That lawyer was the buyer. I didn't know who he worked for. I didn't know who he was. What about the messages? What about the chef's statement? They're fake. Someone created them to frame me. Marlo stepped toward him, trying to take his hand. "Brennan, think. If I were a spy, why would I save your mother? Why would I uncover the poisoning scheme? Why would I?" But Brennan wasn't listening. He stepped back, avoiding her hand as if avoiding fire. The pain of betrayal, coming from the only person he had trusted, had made him blind. His father's words echoed in his mind, louder than any explanation. "Trust no one. Trust no one. Trust no one. Get out of my house," he said, his voice like ice. "Right now." Marlo stood there, stunned. Tears began to run down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She looked at him, looked at the man she had begun to trust, the man with whom she had shared the deepest pain of her life, and in his eyes she saw nothing but rejection. "Brennan," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "Get out!" Marlo stood there, tears streaming down her face. The room had fallen into a suffocating silence after Brennan's shout. She could hear her own heart breaking, piece by piece, like glass shattering across a cold stone floor. She could have begged, could have explained more, could have dropped to her knees, cried, pleaded with him to believe her. She could have told him that she loved him, that she had never betrayed him, that all of this was nothing but an enemy's scheme. She could have done all of that, and maybe, just maybe, he would have listened, but she didn't. Because Marlo Chen Whitfield wasn't someone who begged. She had lived 27 years without bowing her head to anyone. She had lost her mother, been abandoned by her father, been despised by her half-sister, been looked down on by the whole world, and she had still remained standing. She wasn't going to fall apart now. Not for one man, no matter who he was. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, straightened her spine, lifted her chin, looked directly into Brennan's eyes. "I'll go," she said, her voice calm in a way that was almost frightening. So calm that even she was surprised by herself. "But before I do, there's something you should know." Brennan stood there, his face still cold as stone, his eyes still red with fury. He said nothing, didn't move. He only looked at her with the eyes of a man trying to hate someone he had once loved. "I saved your mother when no one else could," Marlowe said, every word clear and steady. "When your expensive doctors ran because they were afraid of responsibility. When your famous experts suggested idiotic methods. I was here. 18 hours a day. 9 days straight. No sleep. No rest. No complaints." She paused and drew in a deep breath. "I did that not for money. Not for you. I did it because she deserved to live. Because I lost my own mother. And I didn't want anyone else to suffer that kind of pain if I had the power to stop it." She walked toward the door, each step heavy as lead, yet steady without the slightest wavering. When she reached the threshold, she stopped and turned her head to look at Brennan one last time. "And if you think I'm a traitor because of a pile of forged papers your enemy sent you, if you're willing to throw away everything we shared because of the fear inside you." Her voice broke for a brief second, but she swallowed the pain and kept going. "Then maybe you never deserved my trust in the first place." She stepped out into the night. She didn't look back. She didn't wait for him to call her name. She didn't hope he would run after her and say he had been wrong. She simply walked away, one step at a time, out of the $1,000,000 mansion and out of the life of the man she had begun to love. Brennan stood alone in the empty room. The stack of papers still lay on the table, the video still looping on the phone screen, but he wasn't looking at them anymore. He was staring into the empty space where Marlowe had just stood, and his heart hurt as if someone had ripped it cleanly in two. Part of him wanted to run after her, wanted to catch her hand and tell her he had been wrong, wanted to pull her into his arms and apologize, but he didn't, because his father's words were still echoing in his head, louder than any other voice. Trust no one. He had kept that promise for 10 years. He wasn't going to break it now, not even in pain, not even with his heart choking inside him. In the darkness of the hallway, someone stood in silence. Helena. She had heard everything, from her son's shout, to Marlowe's words, to the sound of footsteps fading into the night. She stood there, leaning against the wall, her face half lit and half shadowed beneath the dim light. Brennan turned around and saw his mother. Her eyes were on him. Not angry, not accusing, only disappointed. A disappointment so deep it couldn't be spoken aloud. The disappointment of a mother watching her son make the greatest mistake of his life and being unable to stop him. "Mother," Brennan began. But Helena only shook her head. Then she turned and slowly walked away, leaving her son alone with the decision he had just made. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of the Reeves mansion, but it couldn't lift the heavy atmosphere hanging over the house. Brennan hadn't slept all night. He had sat in his study, staring at the stack of papers on his desk, staring at the video looping again and again on the screen, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing. But Marlowe's eyes kept haunting him, eyes that hadn't begged, hadn't pleaded, holding only pain and disappointment, and her final words, "You never deserved my trust in the first place," kept echoing in his mind, like a sentence passed down against him. A knock sounded at the door. A servant stepped inside and lowered his head. "Sir, Mrs. Helena wants to see you. Right away." Brennan rose and made his way to his mother's room. When he opened the door, he found Helena sitting upright in bed, her back straight, her head held high. She was no longer the frail woman who had just awakened from a coma. She was Helena Reeves, the most powerful woman in this family. And the way she looked at her son was the way one looked at a stranger. "You sent her away?" she asked, her voice stripped of all emotion. "Mother, she..." Brennan started to explain. "Be quiet." 2 words. Only 2. But cold as ice, sharp as a blade. Brennan stopped where he stood. In 32 years of life, he had never heard his mother speak to him in that tone. "You are so much like your father," Helena said, her eyes fixed directly on her son's. "Suspicious of everyone, building walls around your heart, pushing away anyone who dares come close." She paused and drew in a deep breath. "But your father had one thing you do not. He knew when he was wrong. He knew when to set his pride down and apologize. "You don't understand," Brennan tried to say. "I understand far more than you think," Helena cut in, her voice rising just slightly, full of authority. "Do you think because I was in a coma I heard nothing? Do you think I lay there like some lifeless piece of wood?" Brennan fell silent. "I heard her," Helena said, her voice softening a little, though it remained stern. "I heard her sing beside my bed every night. A little lullaby, not a beautiful voice, but full of love. I heard her talk to me, telling me about the weather, about my son, about the small details of the day." She paused, and her eyes shimmered. "I heard her cry. In the late hours of the night, when she thought no one could hear, she cried and called for her mother, Linda. She called her mother's name every time she prayed for me to wake up." Brennan felt as though someone had struck him square in the chest. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. "She didn't pray for money," Helena continued, her voice trembling faintly. "She didn't pray for herself. She didn't pray for anything she might gain from this family. She prayed for me, a stranger she had only just met, to live." She looked at her son, her eyes full of pain. Because she couldn't save her own mother, because she didn't want anyone else to suffer the pain she had endured, because her heart is too big, too beautiful, too pure to do the things you are accusing her of. Brennan stood there like a statue of stone. Every certainty he had clung to the night before was breaking apart piece by piece. Helena reached out and took her son's hand. Her hand was still weak, but she held on with the strength of a mother trying to save her child from his own mistake. "Go verify the things Conrad sent you," she said, her voice gentler now, though still firm. "Use your mind, not your fear. Look at the evidence with the eyes of a leader, not the eyes of the 22-year-old boy who lost his father." She tightened her grip. "Don't let your enemy turn your fear into a weapon. Don't let Conrad win without even lifting a hand." She looked straight into his eyes, her voice now like a command. "And find her, before it's too late." Brennan stood there, his heart clenched so tightly it hurt. His mother's words drove deep into his mind, shattering every defense he had built around himself. He remembered Marlowe's eyes as she walked out the door, remembered her calm voice filled with pain, remembered the nights she had sat beside his mother's bed, singing lullabies, praying, crying in silence. And he realized it then. He had been wrong, completely wrong. He had let fear blind his reason. He had let his father's words become chains. He had pushed away the only woman who had ever dared to love him without asking for anything in return. "I'll find her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise." Brennan ordered everything to be verified again. Immediately. No waiting. He called in the best teams money could buy, experts in technology, forensics, and investigation. He wanted the truth, and he wanted it now. The results came back within hours. The apartment sale contract was real. Marlowe had sold her mother's apartment 5 years earlier, exactly as she had said. But when Brennan's investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Marcus Webb, Blackwood's lawyer, had simply been the buyer. There had been no other transactions between the two of them. No secret agreements, no regular payments. Just one ordinary real estate sale. And after that, they had never contacted each other again. The text messages were fake. Brennan's IT specialists analyzed the metadata from the screenshots. It didn't match. The file creation times didn't line up with the times shown in the messages. The font had slight inconsistencies invisible to the naked eye. And most importantly, when enlarged, there were traces of editing software around the edges of the text lines. All of it was forged. Forged with remarkable skill, but still forged. The chef's statement had been coerced. When Brennan's bodyguards found the former chef and interrogated him, the man confessed everything. He was trembling, his face drained of all color, admitting the truth in terrified gasps. Conrad Blackwood had threatened to harm his family if he didn't give the statement according to a script. He had never met Marlowe. He had never received herbs from her. Everything he had said in the statement was a lie, written in advance by Conrad's men. Brennan sat in his study, staring at the new evidence piling up in front of him. Every sheet of paper, every report, felt like a knife being driven into his chest. He had been played. Conrad hadn't attacked him with guns or force. He had attacked him with something far more dangerous. Brennan's own fear. The fear of betrayal. The fear of trusting the wrong person. The fear his father had planted in him with his dying words. And Brennan had let that fear destroy the most precious thing he had. "Find her now," Brennan shot to his feet and shouted at Keith. Right now! The bodyguards rushed to Marlowe's apartment in Skid Row. They kicked the door open and searched every corner. Empty. The apartment was completely empty. Her clothes were still in the closet. The cabinet of herbal medicine was untouched. But Marlowe wasn't there. Keith checked the security cameras in the area, and he froze when he saw the footage on the screen. Last night, around 2 o'clock in the morning, only a few hours after Marlowe had left the Reeves mansion, the footage showed her walking alone on the sidewalk, her shoulders bowed as if she were carrying the weight of the world. Then, a black truck pulled up beside her. 3 men jumped out. Marlowe tried to fight back. She punched, kicked, struggled, but she was one woman against 3 large men. They dragged her into the truck in less than 20 seconds. The door slammed shut. The vehicle disappeared into the night. Keith ran the license plate, and his heart nearly stopped when the result came up. The truck belonged to a transport company at the port of Long Beach. That company was owned by Conrad Blackwood. Keith turned to Brennan, his face white as death. Boss, she's been taken. Blackwood has her. Brennan stood there, his face pale as paper. His hand gripped the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. Conrad had taken Marlowe. This was the trap. He knew Brennan would discover the truth. He knew Brennan would go looking for her, and he was waiting. But Brennan didn't care whether it was a trap or not. He had pushed her away the night before. He hadn't believed her. He had left her alone to face an enemy he should have protected her from. If anything happened to Marlowe, it would be his fault, and he would never forgive himself. Prepare everything, Brennan said, his voice cold as steel, but his eyes burned with a fire no one dared meet directly. Weapons, cars, men, everything we have. Keith hesitated. Boss, this is obviously a trap. Conrad wants to lure you there. I know. Brennan cut in without a second of hesitation. And I'm still going, because I left her alone once. I won't do it a second time. He strode out of the room, every step echoing like the beat of war drums. We're going to the port, and if Conrad has touched a single hair on her head, I'll burn his entire empire to the ground. An abandoned warehouse at the port of Long Beach. The smell of sea salt and rust filled the damp air. Weak light from a few bare bulbs hanging loosely from the ceiling created pockets of black shadow in every corner. The sound of waves striking the concrete seawall echoed from far away, like a dark and distant soundtrack. Marlowe was tied to an old wooden chair, her hands bound tightly behind her back with coarse rope. Her lips were cracked from hours without water. Dark circles hollowed her eyes from lack of sleep, from crying, from everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. But she didn't break. She didn't beg. She sat there with her back straight and her head held high, as if this were her own living room instead of the warehouse of the men who had kidnapped her. Conrad Blackwood stood in front of her, smiling with smug satisfaction. He was tall, his silver hair slicked back, dressed in an expensive suit, as if he were attending a gala instead of holding a hostage. On either side of him stood 2 large enforcers, their faces cold as stone, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. Poor fat girl, Conrad said, his voice dripping with contempt. Brennan threw you out. You're worthless to him now. No one's coming to save you. Marlowe lifted her head. Her eyes looked straight into Conrad's, and what made him falter was that she wasn't afraid. Not even a little. Her gaze was strangely calm, as if she were sitting in a cafe instead of tied up in a mafia boss's warehouse. I don't need anyone to save me. Conrad raised an eyebrow, the smile on his lips stiffening slightly. This wasn't the reaction he had expected from a hostage. Marlowe let her eyes move slowly around the room, passing over each man the way a doctor studies a patient. You, she said, directing her gaze toward the enforcer standing in the left corner, the one on the left. You keep rubbing your stomach and avoiding bright light. Severe gastric ulcer. You've been enduring it with high-dose pain medication, haven't you? I'd guess omeprazole, maybe combined with codeine. But that dose isn't going to hold for much longer. You need surgery within 6 months if you don't want your stomach to perforate. The enforcer flinched and stepped back. His eyes widened as if Marlowe had just read his mind. And you on the right, Marlowe continued, her voice still calm, as if she were reading from a medical report. Your hands are shaking and you're sweating cold even though it isn't hot. Your pupils are abnormally dilated. Your body is missing something. She tilted her head slightly. And whatever it isn't good for you. I'd say you've been without it for about 12 hours. In another 6, you'll start shaking uncontrollably. After that comes the seizure. The second man went pale and swallowed hard. He looked at Conrad as though he wanted to say something, but didn't dare open his mouth. Marlowe turned her gaze to Conrad, and for the first time, she smiled, a cold, sharp smile, like a knife. "And you, Mr. Blackwood? You keep pressing your left chest and breathing shallowly when you're under stress. Your heart is already failing you. Atrial fibrillation. If I'm not mistaken, combined with a high-fat diet and the stress of a life like yours." She tilted her head again. "I'd give you 2 to 3 years if you keep going like this. Maybe less if you run into something that makes your heart race too hard." Conrad froze. The smug smile vanished from his face completely. What do you know?" "I'm a clinical nutrition specialist," Marlowe cut in, her voice cold as ice. "I read the human body the way other people read books. Every movement, every symptom, tells me a story. And I know 47 herbs that could make your health problems." She paused, looking directly into Conrad's eyes. "Move faster." Conrad stepped closer, his face flushed dark with rage. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Marlowe answered, utterly unshaken even though his face was only inches from hers. "I'm telling the truth. Kill me, if you want. But remember one thing." She leaned forward as much as the ropes would allow. "I already scheduled an automatic email to the FBI about your shipping network at this port. Everything I found while investigating the poisoning of Helena Reeves. Every connection. Every piece of evidence." Conrad's eye twitched. "If I don't cancel that email within 2 hours," Marlowe continued, her voice steady and absolute, "it will send itself automatically. To the FBI, to the DEA, to every agency that might be interested in your operations. Along with a full file on the poisoning of Helena Reeves." She smiled. "I arranged my insurance a long time ago, Mr. Blackwood. Before you ever thought about laying a hand on me." Conrad stood there as his face shifted from red to purple, furious and frightened. He looked at Marlowe as if staring at a venomous snake he had mistaken for a worm. This heavy-set girl wasn't a hostage. She was a ticking bomb. And the clock was counting down. The warehouse door burst open with a thunderous crash. Metal slammed against the wall, and the echo rolled through the vast space like thunder announcing a storm. Brennan charged in, his men behind him like an army. Guns were aimed straight at Conrad and his enforcers. His eyes swept quickly across the room, searching for the girl he had driven away, the girl he had failed to trust, the girl he was willing to walk into hell to find again. Then he froze. Marlowe was sitting there, tied to a chair, her lips cracked dry, dark circles beneath her eyes. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She wasn't shrinking in fear like any hostage Brennan had ever seen. She was sitting with her back straight, her head held high, staring directly into Conrad's eyes with a gaze as cold as ice. And Conrad, the mafia boss of San Francisco, the man who had made the entire West Coast tremble, was standing there with a pale face and beads of sweat gathering on his forehead. She was controlling the situation, even tied up, even kidnapped, even facing the most dangerous enemy. She was still in control. Conrad looked at Brennan, then at Marlowe, then back at Brennan. He calculated fast. Brennan's army was larger, better armed. The girl's email would be sent in less than an hour. And his heart was beating wildly from stress, exactly as she had warned. "Take her," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to keep his composure. "I don't need her anymore. We can negotiate about other matters." Brennan didn't even look at him. He signaled for Keith and the bodyguards to deal with Conrad and his men. Then he ran to Marlowe. His steps hurried as if he feared she would disappear if he lost even a second. He dropped to his knees in front of her. The most feared mafia boss in Los Angeles was kneeling before a girl tied to a chair in the middle of an abandoned warehouse, in front of dozens of watching men, and he didn't care who saw, didn't care whether it made him look weak in their eyes. His hands trembled as he untied the ropes. The coarse cords had left red marks around her wrists, and every one of those marks felt like a blade cutting into his heart. He had caused this. He had pushed her out into the night, into the hands of the enemy. "I'm sorry." His voice broke, rough and torn, as if every word were being ripped from his throat. "Marlowe, I'm sorry." Marlowe looked at him. Her brown eyes were no longer calm and icy the way they had been when facing Conrad. Now there was pain in them, hurt. The wound he had inflicted the night before, the wound still bleeding inside her. She said nothing. "I was wrong," Brennan continued, taking her hand in his. holding it as if he were cradling the most precious thing in the world. I didn't trust you. I let fear blind me. I listened to my enemy instead of looking at everything you did for me, for my mother. He lifted his head and looked straight into her eyes. His own eyes were red, not with fury like the night before, but with tears rising, threatening to spill over. I almost lost you. His voice broke apart. I almost lost you forever. Marlo looked at him, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. Not tears of weakness. Tears of someone who had tried to stay strong for too long and was finally allowing herself to feel. You sent me away, she said, her voice trembling. You didn't trust me. You looked at me like I was the enemy. I know, Brennan nodded, not trying to defend himself, not trying to explain, and that was the greatest mistake of my life. Not because you saved my mother, not because you're skilled or brilliant. He tightened his hold on her hand. But because you're the only person who has ever made me want to trust again. After 10 years of keeping my heart shut, you're the only one who has ever made me want to open it. He stood, then pulled her into his arms, held her tightly, as if he feared she would disappear the moment he let go. Held her as if the whole world no longer existed, as if there were only the two of them left in this warehouse stinking of sea salt and rust. Don't leave again, he whispered against her ear, his voice thick with emotion. Please. Don't leave. Marlo stood in his arms, her body stiff. She wanted to push him away. Wanted to say she didn't need him. Wanted to prove that she could face everything alone. But she was tired. Tired of always having to be strong. Tired of always being alone. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed them against his back. I'm not promising anything, she said, her voice still shaking. I can't promise that I'll forgive you right away. You hurt me. You'll have to prove yourself with actions, not words. Brennan nodded and held her even tighter. I will prove it. I'll spend my whole life proving it. Every day, every hour, every minute, until you believe I'm worthy of you. 1 week later, the Reeves mansion blazed with light like a palace in the Los Angeles night. 200 elite guests were in attendance, the most powerful faces in the city, the names that appeared in Forbes and on television. Politicians, business magnates, entertainment stars. Every one of them had come at the invitation of the Reeves family, and no one had dared refuse. The grand hall was filled with the fragrance of fresh flowers and costly champagne. Classical music drifted through the air from the live orchestra in the corner of the room. Magnificent evening gowns, perfectly tailored suits, jewels sparkling beneath the crystal chandeliers, and in the middle of all that luxury, Helena Reeves stood on a small platform, her hand clasped tightly around Marlo's. Helena had recovered completely. She stood there with her back straight and her head held high, authority radiating from every movement. There was no trace left of the woman who had once lain unconscious in a hospital bed. There was only the matriarch of the Reeves family, the most powerful woman in that room. Today, I want to introduce you all to a very special woman. The entire room fell silent. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward the two women standing on the platform. Marlo stood there in an elegant deep blue gown Helena had chosen for her, her hair styled in a way that was simple but refined. She wasn't trying to hide her body, wasn't trying to look smaller, thinner, or different. She stood there exactly as she was. She wasn't born into silk and privilege, Helena continued, her voice carrying through the hall. She has no powerful family standing behind her. No inherited fortune. She comes from a place none of you would ever dare set foot in. Helena looked around the room, her gaze moving across each face. Some were curious, some were surprised, and some held that condescending look she knew all too well. But she did what none of you could do, she said, her voice turning sharp with cold authority. She saved my life. She raised her champagne glass high. This is Marlo Chen Whitfield, my future daughter-in-law. A ripple of whispers rose like waves through the room. 200 people began murmuring, speculating, judging. Marlo could feel every stare prying into her, every comment being murmured behind fans and champagne glasses. Helena smiled, a cold smile, sharp as a knife. And if anyone has any opinion about my family's decision, she paused and swept her gaze across the room. Remember that she knows 47 herbs that could make you disappear without a trace, and I know where to bury you. The hall went silent as death. No one even dared breathe too loudly. Then Brennan stepped up beside Marlo, wrapping an arm around her waist. He lifted his glass and looked down at the crowd. "Applaud my fiancé." The applause came, scattered at first, then louder and louder, until it filled the room, not because they were truly happy, but because no one dared do otherwise. In the corner of the room, Whitney Ashford stood pale-faced, trying to avoid everyone's eyes. She, the doctor who earned $50,000 a week, the woman who had run away when Helena needed help, now stood there like a ghost of failure. And then, in the middle of the crowd, a familiar figure appeared. Paige, Marlowe's half-sister. She had come out of curiosity after hearing rumors of her older sister's coming wedding to the most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles. "Sis, it's been so long." Paige stepped forward with that fake, friendly smile Marlowe had seen hundreds of times before. "I never imagined you would." Marlowe looked at her half-sister, the girl who had once called her fat sister, the girl who had taken the inheritance their mother left behind when Marlowe had been too young to fight back, the girl who had once texted her not to come to the wedding because she didn't want guests thinking the family had bad genes. Marlowe smiled faintly, without anger, without bitterness, only calm. "How did the Maldives wedding turn out?" Paige went pale. The wedding had been called off. Her fiancé had discovered that she loved his money, not him. The rumors had already spread through elite society. Marlowe didn't wait for an answer. "Good luck," she said, then turned and walked away. With Brennan's hand in hers, she moved through the crowd without looking back at her half-sister. She didn't need revenge, didn't need to gloat, didn't need to prove anything anymore. She had already won, not by dragging someone else down, but by rising above everything that had once tried to pull her under. After the party, when the last guest had finally gone and the mansion was slowly falling quiet again, Brennan took Marlowe's hand and led her out into the back garden. The moon hung bright over the Los Angeles sky, round and clear like a jewel suspended in the night. A gentle breeze moved through the air, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the carefully trimmed bushes. This was the garden where Marlowe had once sat alone and cried on the 6th night, where Brennan had come to sit beside her without saying a word. Now, beneath the moonlight, it looked like an entirely different world. Brennan stopped in the middle of the garden and turned to face her. Then he fell silent. Marlowe looked at him and waited. The monster of Los Angeles stood there, tall and powerful, the man who made an entire city tremble. But right now, he looked like a boy who didn't know what to do with his hands, didn't know where to look. "What is it?" she asked, one corner of her mouth lifting slightly. Brennan swallowed. "I'm not good at saying these things." "What things?" Brennan drew in a deep breath. Then he did something Marlowe had never expected. He went down on one knee. Marlowe froze. The monster of Los Angeles, the man who never bowed to anyone, was kneeling in front of her in the middle of the garden at night. Marlowe Chen Whitfield. His voice trembled faintly. Not from fear, but from the emotion rising inside his chest. "I don't have a diamond ring. I didn't prepare this. I don't have beautiful words like the ones in films." He lifted his head to look at her, his eyes shining beneath the moonlight. "All I have is a heart that was frozen for 10 years, a heart I thought would never beat again, and you are the only person who made it beat again." Marlowe stood there as tears began to gather in her eyes. "I know I was wrong," Brennan continued. "I know I hurt you. I didn't trust you when I should have. I pushed you away when I should have held on to you." He took her hand and cradled it in both of his. "But if you give me a lifetime, I'll spend every day making up for it. Every day. Every hour. Every minute." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Not because I need you. Because I want you. I choose you. Marlowe, will you marry me?" Marlowe looked down at him. The monster was kneeling there, his eyes red, his voice shaking. The most powerful mafia boss in Los Angeles was opening himself completely, placing his heart in her hands, giving her the power to refuse him, to break him apart. And she knew that, even after he had hurt her, even after he had failed to trust her, this was still the man she wanted beside her. "I'm not easy, Brennan," she said, her voice thick with tears. "I'm not gentle. I'm not beautiful in the way the world expects. I'm stubborn, difficult, and I will never become the kind of woman who stands quietly behind you." Brennan smiled, the warmest smile she had ever seen on his face. "I know," he said. "You're bold, stubborn, and you threaten people with 47 poisonous herbs." He gave a soft laugh. "And I love every one of those things. I don't want a woman standing behind me. I want one standing beside me. And you're that woman. Marlo laughed through her tears. She laughed because she was happy, because she felt lighter, because for the first time in her life, she felt loved exactly as she was. All right, she said, her voice breaking. I'm staying. Brennan went still, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Really? Really. Marlo nodded, tears spilling freely now, but on one condition. Anything. Marlo tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with mischief. If you betray me again, if you ever dare not trust me one more time, I'll use herb number 32. Brennan arched a brow. What's number 32? You don't want to know. Brennan laughed, and the sound carried into the night. Then he rose to his feet and pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if he were afraid she might disappear. I wouldn't dare, he whispered against her ear. I promise. Marlo rested her head against his chest, listening to the sound of his heart beating. The heart that had been frozen for 10 years was beating strongly now, beating for her, and for the first time in a very long while, she felt that she belonged somewhere. 1 year later, the morning sun of Los Angeles poured brilliantly over Skid Row, the place that had once been the darkest corner of the city, the place people used to avoid. But today, something was different. Marlo stood in front of a brand new building, painted a bright, clean white, standing out against the worn old streets around it. This was where she had once lived in a miserable apartment. This was where she had once walked every Friday night, carrying bags of medicine and food, handing them out to the homeless through the Linda nights that had stretched on for 4 years. The large sign in front of the building gleamed beneath the sunlight, the Linda Chen Nutrition Center. And beneath it, a smaller line, like a promise to everyone who stepped through those doors. Illness doesn't ask who can afford it. Marlo read those words, and tears rose in her eyes. This was the dream she had never dared to dream. This was the thing she had thought would never happen. A free medical center, where the poor could be examined, receive nutritional counseling, and be cared for without worrying about money. Named after her mother, Brennan stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder. He looked at her with eyes full of love, the kind of look she couldn't have imagined seeing on the face of the cold mafia boss just 1 year earlier. Your mother would be so proud, he said softly. Marlo smiled, tears shining on her cheeks. I know. She looked at the line of people waiting outside the center, homeless men and women in ragged clothes, single mothers carrying small children in their arms, thin little children with wide, curious eyes, elderly people with faces worn down by life. They were the people society often forgot, the same kind of people her mother had cared for all her life. I couldn't save my mother, Marlo said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. I tried with everything I had, but I couldn't save her. Brennan tightened his hand around hers and said nothing, only listening. But I can save other people, she continued, looking at the line before her. I can do what my mother did her whole life. I can carry on her legacy. Brennan kissed her forehead, his lips warm and gentle. And I'll be beside you, every step, every day, for the rest of this life. Soft footsteps sounded behind them. Helena walked over, still elegant and commanding as always, but the way she looked at Marlo was filled with love. She took her daughter-in-law's hand and squeezed it gently. Linda would be very happy to see her daughter become this kind of woman, Helena said, her voice warm. She would be proud of you, just as I am proud of you. Marlo looked at her, the second mother she had never dared to dream of, the woman who had welcomed her into a family when she had no one left, the woman who had called her daughter when the whole world had treated her like an outsider. Thank you, Mother, she said, her voice breaking, for everything, for believing in me, for giving me a family. Helena smiled and lifted a hand to wipe the tears from her daughter-in-law's cheek. No, my child, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You saved my life. You saved my son from the darkness. You brought light into this cold house. Brennan pulled Marlo into his arms from behind, holding her close, his chin resting on the top of her head. The two of them stood there, looking at the center that carried her mother's name, looking at the line of people waiting to be helped, and feeling that everything had finally found its rightful place. The girl handing out medicine in the dark changed my life, Brennan whispered against her ear. Marlo looked up at him, her eyes shining. And the monster in the dark gave me a family. That was the story of Brennan and Marlo, the monster who found the light, the abandoned girl who found a home. From Linda Knight to the Linda Chen Center, from a miserable apartment to $1 million mansion, from loneliness to being loved, If this story touched your heart, please press like right now to support us. Please share this video with the people you believe understand that real love doesn't require a perfect appearance, that a person's true value lies in the heart, not in outward beauty. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the compelling stories we share every day. How did this story make you feel? Which character impressed you the most? Which moment brought tears to your eyes? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly hope to hear what's in your hearts. Every comment you leave is a source of encouragement that helps us continue creating better and better content. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every single day. Thank you for spending your time with us all the way to the very end. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.